Hey Nerdy Knitters, Tanya here. Welcome to episode 1 of the Nerdy Knitting Podcast 2022. Thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. I invite you to grab a cup or a mug or a glass of your favorite drink. I've got some coffee in my mug today. And settle in with your knitting and let's chat about what's on our needles, what's off our needles, things in the news, and lots of other knitting goodness. And everything we discuss in the video today will be linked down below in the video description box. I'd like to start this episode with interesting things I've seen in the news, articles I've read, or things I saw on social media, or things that popped into my email inbox. Now, the first bit of news I have to share is about the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics. They have something pretty interesting, I thought, that they shared on Twitter. During the victory ceremony, when medals are awarded, and they usually hand out bouquets and things like that, this year they're going to be handing out knitted bouquets. The victors will receive bouquets of hand-knit flowers. Here's some pictures right here that you can see of these beautiful bouquets that have been hand-knit just for the winners of the 2022 Olympics. Thought that was pretty interesting, and you'll find the link for that down below if you want to click through and see some more pictures of those hand-knit bouquets. The second interesting thing that I saw was a survey about wool production in Canada. I live in Canada, so it was interesting to me, but it might be interesting to you as knitting in general, just to understand more about wool production in different countries. Now, this was a survey conducted by Anna Hunter of Longway Homestead to discover how much wool is grown and processed in Canada. She had 147 responses to her survey, so she collected all of the survey results and then put them into this really interesting infograph. Something that I found interesting was that 86% of ththose surveyed were women, and women-owned fiber farms. And the production amount, I thought, it seemed like a lot to me, but I'm not sure what production of wool is in different countries. 75,000 pounds, but lots more interesting facts if you want to click through and see more about that interesting survey that she conducted. Now, one more bit of news before we dive into talking about our knitting, but Craftsy now has an app. If you have any classes on Craftsy, usually you would have to watch them from a desktop or from a browser on your tablet or mobile device, but now they have an app that you can download and put on your devices, and if you have access to any Craftsy classes or if you are a member, then you can download that app and use that to watch your classes. Now, last year on the Nerdy Knitting YouTube channel, I didn't have a podcast. We had a twice monthly live stream where I did share some podcasty things I was knitting and things about knitting in the news, and I also answered knitting questions, and I want to continue to do that in this podcast. I am a knitting teacher and I'm almost a master knitter. I'm finishing up level 3 right now. So I've got a bit of experience with knitting and I'm happy to answer any knitting questions. So Michelle had a question about knitting with linen yarn and what she should know about linen before she makes any expensive purchases. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about fibers, linen specifically, but fibers in general as well. And maybe we'll discuss more about fibers in the coming weeks. There's a lot to talk about. Different fibers have different properties, and linen has some pretty specific and interesting ones of its own as well. Fibers for yarn can be divided into 4 basic categories. You have animal fibers like wool, alpaca, and silk. Llama, camel, anything that comes from an animal would fall under animal fibers. And then you have plant fibers like linen, cotton, hemp. Those would all be considered plant fibers. Sources of where organic plant material are the source for the yarn. And then you have biosynthetic fibers and synthetic fibers. Those are 2 different categories. Synthetic are like completely man-made fibers like acrylic or nylon. They're all petrochemical based. But then similar to that is biosynthetic, which is sort of a mix of your plant fibers and your synthetic. It's a plant fiber based, like from rayon comes from like birch trees, I believe. And then there's bamboo, which can be used for yarn. It doesn't fall into plant fiber category because it takes more to process those fibers. You can't just crush up some bamboo and turn it into yarn. There's a lot more to the process. It has to be like some sort of chemical process has to be done to that plant matter to break it down enough to turn it into usable fiber. So it's sort of a cross between a synthetic and a plant. It has plant as its base matter, but it takes a synthetic process to turn it into yarn. And then the synthetics, of course, which are completely chemical based. So all yarns fall within one of those 4 broad categories. And while each yarn has its own specific advantages and disadvantages. Each of those categories also have some broader specific things, like all the plant fibers are generally more heavy and they're not very elastic. Each one will vary, of course, but that's a general thing. Animal fibers are generally pretty warm. So we're going to talk about linen specifically because that was Michelle's question, but I think we'll talk about more of these other fibers later on. But linen, okay, it's been a textile for a long time, just a bit of history. Let me see, I wrote down here, early fragments dating from 8000 BC. So linen has been a fabric for a very long time, and it has to go through quite a process. It comes from flax plant. They have to like break it down and mash it up, and there's a whole thing that has to go through to be turned into plant fiber. I really would like to know how they originally thought that, hey, let's turn this reed into clothes, but somebody obviously came up with that. Now it has some clear advantages. It's very, very strong. It's really very smooth. It has beautiful drape. If you've ever had like linen pants or a linen dress, they're cool and they're smooth and they have that beautiful drape and flow. Well, in the case of the fabric, it does wrinkle. I don't think the yarn would, I don't think you would say it would wrinkle like, but linen fabric does. It's moisture wicking. It is quick drying. It's non-pilling. It's actually antifungal and antibacterial. I thought that was pretty interesting. And it gets softer and softer the more it's washed. So you just enhance that lovely soft quality. So all of these things makes it really great for warm weather garments because of its cooling and moisture wicking properties. And it softens with time and repeated washings. So they will have beautiful, beautiful drape, especially the more it's washed and worn and used. And it's also a great choice for hand towels and washcloths because of that moisture wicking and antibacterial properties. Linen does have some drawbacks. It's inelastic, it's very heavy, and it's stiff to work with. So if you've ever knit with linen, or if you scroll on Instagram and maybe you see somebody else's project that's in linen, while it's on your needles, it looks like a mess. It just doesn't look very good at all. But once it's finished and you wash it and you take care of it, however the yarn label tells you to, then it will soften and become just a beautiful, beautiful fabric. But it is hard to work with. It's hard on the hands because it's not elastic. Now, this is something that's present in all plant fibers. I think all of them, as far as I can remember right now. When you think of an elastic, you can stretch it and it will snap back into shape. Wool has wonderful elasticity. You can knit with it, you can stretch it, and it will pull back into shape. So your ribbing always looks really good in wool. In a plant fiber, when you do something that has ribbing, you'll notice it looks droopy and it just doesn't look very good because it doesn't have that stretch and that snap back factor. It's just going to keep the shape it's in the way it is, and it will droop over time because of the heaviness, but it can't snap back because it doesn't have that elasticity. So that elasticity can affect the way the finished project looks, but it also affects the way it feels as you're knitting. With wool, that elasticity makes it easy to knit with because there's a lot of give to the yarn itself. With plant fibers, cotton and linen and all of them like that, they don't have that elasticity, so they're harder on your hands to knit with because there's no give. I don't know if you've ever noticed when you work on one project that's maybe in an animal fiber and then you switch to a plant fiber and you notice like your hands feel tight or sore. It's because of that inelastic nature of a plant fiber. So it has its advantages, it has its disadvantages. It's hard to knit with, can be hard to knit with, depending on the project, and it's very heavy. So you have to be careful about the projects you choose because of that inelastic nature and that heaviness. If you knit like a big oversized pullover with lots of cables, that sweater is going to droop if you do it in a plant fibers because cable fabric also obviously takes more yarn, so that project is going to be heavier. And the cables aren't going to look very good because you really need that elastic nature of an animal fiber to make your cables look nice, because that inelastic plant fiber, it's going to be hard to knit them and they're just not going to look very nice. So as long as you keep these things in mind when you're choosing patterns, first off, I would recommend choosing a pattern that was knit with at least that same fiber type. If not exactly linen, at least maybe a plant fiber, because all of the plant fibers sort of have those same similar qualities. So you could look at knitting patterns that are knit in cotton or bamboo or other plant fibers, and you could sort of interchange them most likely. The designer hopefully keeps the properties of the yarn in mind when they're designing. But if you want to look at other patterns that aren't necessarily plant fiber based, there are some things I would think about before I chose a pattern for, if I knew I had linen yarn and I wanted a pattern for it. I would not choose something seamless because, well, seams give garment structure. You can get away with seamless with wool because of that elasticity, but because your linen and your plant fibers don't have that snap back factor, it's just going to keep drooping. So if you don't have seams on top of that, then it might just end up being a hot mess and it won't look very good. I would also avoid highly textured stitch patterns and cables because it's going to be hard to knit them, and those stitch patterns take more yarn, so that adds to the heaviness factor. So I would look for light summer things, tank tops, shawls, any accessories where you want that lovely drape. Those linen fibers would be perfect. Summer weight sweaters and tank tops, especially with seams, would work really well, I think. Or your household goods like hand towels and washcloths and things like that would be great in linen. One more thing, I do have a website and I have some articles on there, and I did a whole series on different types of fibers for knitting, and I have one for linen, so I'll put a link for that down below and you can check that out as well if you want to learn more about linen yarn. I hope that was helpful, Michelle. Now, before we jump into talking about knitting, I just want to share our sponsor for this episode is Amazon's Audible. I've been listening to the Outlander series again. I've re-listened to them quite a few times, but it's sort of my comfort listen. When I've got nothing else to listen to, I pop in one of the Outlander books and listen to that. So if you like to listen to audiobooks and you're already not a member of Audible, you can get a free month trial as well as 2 free audiobooks. You'll find the link down below if you want to give that a try. Now let's talk about knitting. I don't have any finished objects, but I do have a few things on my needles. I finished the front and the back of my Master Knitting Level 3 sweater. There's the back. And there is the front, which is exactly the same, except we also have like a little bit of a crew neck at the top. So lots of cables. That was a lot of work. This was quite an adventure, but it's nice to see I'm almost at the end of this sweater, and then I will be ready to box this up. I'm hoping by February and send it off, and then it will be a few months before I hear back, and I know, and I'll most likely have things I'll have to redo and resubmit, and then hopefully I will be a certified master knitter. But this was a big project. I started it last summer. I got 2 skeins of yarn to test out for swatching. I used Knit Picks Wool of the Andes worsted, just the bare yarn. So I got 2 skeins so I could practice swatching and make sure I wanted to use the yarn. And I did all my swatches. I really liked the way it looked. So I did my math, got everything figured out. And then I went to, so I just started the back with the 2 skeins I had. Started the back of the sweater. And then I went to order more yarn and it was out of stock. And it was out of stock. And it was out of stock for a long time. I don't think it was back in stock until like November. So I even took all my swatches out and steamed the yarn so I could reuse them, so I could get as much of the back done as possible. And I got about 2/3 of it done. I needed a 1/3 skein to finish the back. So that was on hold for quite a while. And then the yarn was in stock, so I finally ordered enough to finish the whole sweater. And I started the front, and the more I kept looking at it, the more I kept thinking this sweater doesn't look as good as I would like. Mostly that knit before purl transition, which if in a cable sweater happens a lot, especially those left leaning cables, those knit stitches right before a purl didn't look good. I had gaps between that purl stitch and that knit stitch. The ribbing didn't look that great. So I stopped knitting for a bit and I went back to practice some different techniques. I've tried lots of different techniques over the year to make that ribbing look better, especially that last knit before purl in my 2x2 ribbing. I did working the stitch mount different, tightening up the stitch. I did all of those things, but it didn't look, I ended up looking like it had the zigzag stitch effect instead. I think because I was just tightening it up way too much. And then I remembered way back in level 1 when I had this issue, I had I used the Norwegian purl method, which you would think wouldn't work because you don't bring the yarn to the front, you keep it to the back, but you do this whole weird wrapping the yarn around your needle and into the stitch, and it actually makes the stitch wider while you're doing it. But because of that elastic nature of wool, those stitches snap back and it looks really good. So I decided to start trying that again. And once I started using the Norwegian purl, just in those locations, whenever I had to move from a knit stitch to a purl stitch, I would do that one stitch. I would use that Norwegian method. And you can find lots of videos for that here on YouTube if you're not sure what I'm talking about. And it worked beautifully. It just cleaned up that issue I was having. So at this point, I had finished the whole back of the sweater, like the whole thing. And I had started the front, and I ripped it all out, and I started all over again because it's my final sweater, and I didn't want that to come back and not pass and have to redo it all again anyway because the knitting wasn't that good. So that was my project over Christmas break. It took me a week and a half to reknit the back, and believe me, I was spending all of my free time knitting this back of the sweater. But I'm so happy I did. Like, it was a lot of work, but it's not even blocked yet, and I can tell it looks so much better. So once it's blocked, it's going to look really good. So fingers crossed that this sweater passes when it's finally done. So the back is redone, and the front is finished, and I've started the sleeves, doing them 2 at a time. And I'm using a similar motif. I changed the motif a little bit, and I really like the ribbing on this. I brought it right down. I brought some of the cables right down on the cuff. So it's just started. I've started my increases, and I'm making 2 sleeves. Now this is going to be a saddle shoulder sweater. So I think when it's all done, I'm going to like turn on my camera and just show you the whole process of seaming it together. Maybe I'll do a whole time-lapse video of just that. So that's my master knitting sweater. I'm on the sleeves, and hopefully I'll have those done within the next few weeks and I can get that seamed up. So I've got one more thing to show you. All right, in my little Yarnier sack. I like these little bags for things like small projects. The only thing I don't like about them is because a lot of these little drawstring sacks, the cotton or the material is kind of thin. So I've been trying so many different things to keep my needles from poking through the fabric. I've tried those little plastic stoppers you can get at Michael's or any store. I had these little coil ring things that you just put on the needle tips to hold them together, but of course they still poke through, and even one of the coils just like fell apart. So this is my latest thing to try. My husband got these for me for Christmas at the local yarn store. So it's just a metal tube, and it's got this plastic or rubber stopper on the end with a little slit in it. So you just put your needle tips in there. So far it's working well. They stay in there, and even when I had a cable needle I needed with my sweater, so I would stick that in there as well so I wouldn't lose it. It was all right there. And this is working well. They're keeping my needle tips together and not poking through the fabric. Never had a problem with things falling off my needles as I knit, but I've always had issues with like the needles poking through my little drawstring bags because they're not very thick, these bags. But anyway, so that is something I am liking, these little things. If you have a local yarn shop, I don't even know what they're called, needle protectors maybe. I think they're from Knitter's Pride, Knit Pro, I think. I'm not sure. But anyway, I am working on a shawl. This is Gauge Dye Works, their Whiskey in a Teacup shawl colorway, which has these long color changes. So it's a design that they kindly sent me the yarn so I could design this, and I had this idea that every time the color changed, you would move between 4 different stitch patterns. So, and it's working really well. I think it looks really pretty. So every time the color changes, you switch to a different stitch pattern. It's working out to about 8 rows per color. But of course, whatever, they have to do some sort of math to make sure you have enough of each color to get these stripes work out so perfectly. So I finished all of the main colors, and now there's one big section of gray. So I'm doing another simple stitch pattern on that. And then when I get down to about 25% left of the gray, I have to weigh it again to see. I've got quite a lot left. When I get down to about 25% of this, I think we're going to do a ruffle on the bottom. So it's a top-down triangle shawl. You can see some of the colors there. It's still on the needle, so it's not. Anyway, so the colors are really nice. I really like them. And this has been fun to knit. You know, every time you have a new color in your hand, you just switch to the next stitch pattern. And I'll have instructions on how to do that so you don't get those blips of color changes, but it's really very simple to do. All of the stitch patterns are really easy. There's stockinette garter and then a textured pattern and some eyelet mesh and then some more eyelets and another textured pattern on the gray. So this one is really fun. And I've got a second skein of yarn from them, so that might be another shawl. I think I'm going to do the same thing, but in a different shape, maybe like an asymmetrical triangle. Okay, the yarn is Gauge Dye Works Whiskey in a Teacup. I don't know if you can see that on there. There it goes. Now this, the base is their MCN fingering. It's a 70% superwash merino, 20% cashmere, 10% nylon. So it's very soft. It's going to make a beautiful, beautiful shawl. So that is all that's on my needles right now, but I do have some upcoming projects that I'd like to share. My daughter wants a sweater, so I told her when my master knitter sweater is sent off, I will start on hers, but she had some specifics. She wants a set-in sleeve, shawl collar, patch pockets. She sent me a picture of, it's a character from an anime that she watches. So I don't mind doing this sweater, but I wasn't looking forward to doing all of the measurements and the math to like knit one from scratch. So I was going through some different books to see what I could use that's already done and just add, you know, the shawl collar and the patch pockets and whatever. So I have this book on my shelf, which is a wonderful book, by the way, for knitting your own custom sweaters. She has the basic cardigan, set-in sleeve construction right here. So I'm going to use this as the base, and then I will just add the pockets and the shawl collar to it. And what's really nice about these patterns in this book is all of them have 3 different yarn weights. So you can really customize your own sweater. It's a really, really great book. And she has all of the basic sweater constructions in here: drop shoulder sweaters, raglan sweaters, yoke sweaters, and set-in sleeve. So for each of those, she'll have a pullover sweater and a cardigan. And then she's got a section on adjustments and embellishments, and then 8 more patterns that take all of those basics and then add more things to them, pockets and changing the collars and color work and stitch patterns and things like that. So, and each of the basic designs comes in 3 different yarn weights as well. So it's a lot of sweaters in this book, and she uses a charted format. So you just find your size and the yarn weight that you're using, and you just follow along with the numbers. So I'm going to use this to knit that sweater so I don't have to do all of the math myself. So that won't be coming up until I finish with my master knitting sweater, because that's really my focus right now. I wouldn't say I'm a monogamous knitter. I don't just do one project, but I think because this one I'm so near the end. I bought this level 3. I bought it last year as my Christmas gift. So I've been working on it for a whole year. So I'm ready to get it done and sent out so I can think about other things. Okay, so that's all of that, but I do have one more, a gift that my husband got me for Christmas, but I'm not quite sure what to do with this one yet. I don't have a stash. Is that upside down? Nope, it's not. I don't have a stash of yarn. I buy yarn when I have a project that I want to do, with the exception of like yarn for dishcloths and dish towels. I will pick that up. If I'm at Michael's and it's on sale, I'll buy a bunch of, you know, handicrafted cotton or whatever, and sock yarn. But specifically to knit socks, which I haven't even knit socks in a long time. So I have like a large gallon size Ziploc bag, and I will toss sock yarn in one and the dishcloth yarn in another, because those little things like that. I like to knit dishcloths when I'm like looking at different stitch patterns, or if I'm going to be teaching something on YouTube, then dishcloths are a great way to do that, because the yarn is inexpensive and you still have something you can use after you've practiced that new skill. So I guess if I have a stash, it would be that, but in general, maybe if I were rich, I would just buy yarn all the time, but I don't. When I have a project in mind, then that's when I buy the yarn. Patterns, on the other hand, are another story. I keep buying patterns, and sometimes I have no intention of knitting them. I'm just intrigued by the design, so I want to see how the designer did something. So anyway, I have this yarn. This is a Merino gradient set from Urth Yarns. It is 100% extra fine superwash merino fingering weight, 880 yards, and 4 skeins. So I am thinking some sort of a fade shawl thing, but I don't know yet. I haven't really looked at any patterns to decide what to do with that. So this is kind of fun to have a set of yarn and not quite sure what to do with it. So I have to find a pattern. If you have an idea for me, I'd love to hear about it. So that's all I have for knitting, but I do love to show knitting resources and books as well because, well, this is the Nerdy Knitting YouTube channel, so we have to have a lot of books, right? So this is one I just picked up from the library. I've got a wonderful library system here, and they're really great about ordering books if you request them, if they don't have them, and I was really happy to discover this book, 52 Weeks of Socks. It's a really beautiful book. And if you love to knit socks, then this will keep you busy for a while. Now this is from Lina magazine. Lina, I think that's how you say it. L-A-I-N-E. It's a lovely, lovely book. Lots of patterns and beautiful pictures. Lovely, lovely socks. And there are a few slipper patterns in here as well that I really liked, that I think are lovely. I like slippers around the house too, especially when it's cold like this. The elf slippers. And let me see, there was another one in here I liked. Oh, and I really liked these socks, the Alver socks. It reminds me of like musical notation. I'm not sure why, just those black lines like that. Oh, and these, I really like these, the Hestia slippers. Nope, there we go. My only issue with this book is the photographs are lovely, but sometimes you want close-ups of the project so you can figure out like how it's constructed. I mean, socks are socks. They're only constructed a few different ways. But the slippers, I wanted like the way they cross over like that, I wanted to not quite clear how that's working. So I might have to just get some yarn and knit these for myself. Okay, announcements. I don't know what you'd like to see here. If you'd like me to do maybe some giveaways or some knit alongs or things like that, I'd love to know what you'd like to see, what you'd like to have here on this podcast. I do have a course that will be coming out very soon about fixing your knitting mistakes, starting with just a simple drop stitch, which you might know how to do already, but progressing up to knitting a lace swatch and dropping down and fixing a section of stitches in a lace swatch. So if that's something that interests you, you can join my mailing list. I'll have a link down below because they will hear about it first. But I'm going to be contacting the people on my email list very soon to find out their last minute like questions they would have, things they would want to see addressed in this course about fixing your mistakes. So if you'd like to know about that when that comes out, then I will be doing like a sort of like a little beta launch, I guess, or an alpha launch where I'm just going to open it up to a few people to test it out and tell me what needs to be fixed, what needs to be adjusted, things like that, like if there's things that I didn't cover that I should cover. So if that's something that interests you, you can go to tanyaknits.com/read-your-stitches. There's a link down below, and you just fill out that little box and you'll get a free guide about reading your stitches, and you'll be on the email list so you'll know when that course is ready to progress to the next stage. That's all for this very first episode of the Nerdy Knitting Podcast 2022. So thank you for joining me for today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll be back to watch another one.